Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our 2022 Spring Symposium sessions, symposium recordings. My name is Marley. I am an external lead with Stigma Ends at CU, and today we're talking with Cory Guest. So I'll pass off the not the mic, but the Zoom format to Cory.
That sounds great. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Marley and the others that were engaged in booking me for this. I always start by saying I wish I could see you in person, but the reality that's not going to happen for a little bit. So greetings from Winnipeg. I'll probably take up about an hour of your time, maybe a little bit more. Essentially what you're going to get today is the drug programming or the education that I developed the end of 2016 when we had a large surge in drugs like fentanyl. We all know that happened nationally, but we really noticed it in Manitoba the end of 2016. And essentially, I developed this program because the existing drug programming or education, primarily in our high school system, was still based on scare tactics and misinformation from the 1980s and the early 90s. So I really wanted to correct that. And I wanted to treat substance use and addiction and drug use as a health issue, not as a criminal law issue. It's not a slam on police agencies. I've got a lot of good friends in police. I've got a police family, but I candidly always say I didn't think law enforcement should be the sole owner of drug education in schools. So, you know, historically, you look at drug education, there was no component about trauma. We weren't teaching our communities to be, compassionate. We were just treating it like it was a law issue, where we were still shaming people that were ultimately using drugs. So we need to stop doing that. So that's kind of the presentation that you're going to get today. Very, very briefly, a little bit about myself. I've been a paramedic for a really long time, about 25 years. And that's when I always say you're supposed to be shocked and surprised. You're so young. How can you be doing that for 25 years? That doesn't work very much anymore. But I've been doing this for a long time. I mostly worked in the north end of Winnipeg, which is kind of the core neighborhood of Winnipeg. Then I promoted into our 911 center. Got tired of shift work and lucked out with this position about 8 years ago. So I'm the paramedic public education coordinator. And this takes up about 99% of my time. I was fortunate to be traveling our country doing this before COVID. And now that COVID is starting to slow down, touch wood, that's starting to happen again. And I'm finding myself out in Vancouver again in a couple of weeks, actually, to do some programming out there. And you're going to hear me reference the Indigenous community quite a bit. I'm a northern boy by nature. I spent many years as a young boy growing up in Churchill, Manitoba. So I live with the polar bears and my heart is with the people. I love the people. The highlight of my career was 3 years ago when the Indigenous community approached me to partner. And that meant the world to me because, to be candid, it's too often people that look like me telling the Indigenous community, this is what you have to do. You have to fit into this Western box, and that does not work. So it was a big breath of fresh air when they approached me to partner. And the picture you're looking at is called Walking as One. Mr. Gilbert Fredette is now a very good friend of mine, and he had approached me after I spoke at a national conference, and he said, I think I would like to work with you and partner with you. The premise of that is we not only provide programming within the city of Winnipeg, we go outside the city of Winnipeg provincially and all across the country. So our kickoff is in Vancouver in 2 weeks, and I always just like to bring up that partnership. So I'll start by playing a video, and hopefully we're going to get sound on this. We'll see what happens. So I'm going to kind of date myself a little bit here. And if you don't remember that commercial, that means you haven't had a ton of birthdays. This was the drug, the education that I received in school was literally that video. My phys ed teacher at the time put this tape in, yes, it was a tape, and pushed that commercial, talked about drugs a little bit, checked off that box, and sent us back to our classroom. That does absolutely nothing. The war on drugs in the US failed miserably. They shamed people, they increased stigma, and they created these kind of sexy, Hollywood-based commercials that did nothing. That doesn't talk about the pathophysiology, the pharmacology of substance use disorders. It doesn't humanize folks that are using drugs. it does nothing. So I just kind of put that up there for some humor. So opioids, you've all heard about these. And again, you have to remember that opioids are synthetic. So they're human made. They're typically not grown in somebody's garden. And essentially what happens when you take a drug like fentanyl is it binds to a opioid receptor primarily found within your brain. So you swallow, shoot, inject, smoke, whatever you do with the opioid, it'll bind to that receptor site. And the problem with this is when you overdose or you poison on too much opioid, you cause that receptor site to overload and it ultimately shuts off. And the problem with that is your respiratory drive system that dictates your breathing will also be turned off because it works in that same part of your brain. So kind of the Coles Notes version, but that's essentially what happens when you overdose or poison. Most folks know it's designed to treat pain. The only people that can administer opioids are physicians and advanced care paramedics. That's it. And we were seeing actually a national trend where some of our patients were refusing fentanyl because they watch the news and they think it's instant death, like they connect fentanyl to absolute death. And we know that that's not true. Fentanyl given in a controlled setting is very safe and a very good medication. So it was kind of saddening when folks were experiencing some injuries or whatever issues they're having with pain and they were refusing fentanyl. There's a big difference from legitimate opioids versus the stuff that you're buying off the street. And the term you might hear of is a kill pill. That's a street term that's often used. And essentially that is a criminally manufactured pill to look like something that it's not. So we have a supply of fake T3s, fake Xanax, fake Percocet, fake Oxy, the list goes on and on. It's designed to look like something it's not. And with drug testing, often it is pure fentanyl. That's why a lot of folks are dying. They're often not getting what they actually want. The reason why they call it a kill pill is the highest fentanyl I know about in one pill had enough to kill about 8 people. That was found in one of the pills that was floating around our city. And I always talk to groups and I say, if you have the attitude that you hear of a substance user dying or a person that uses drugs or somebody struggling with substance use disorder and they die, and you have the attitude, good, that's just another one gone, shame on you. And, you know, usually if people are sitting in front of me, not virtually, I can kind of palpate people that are feeling that way. And I can't read social media comments anymore. I do quite a bit of media locally, and I frankly don't care what people think about me. I've got pretty thick skin, but I can't read the social media comments because people still say, good, it's just another one dead, good. If you think like that, I challenge you to sit in front of one of my best friends who's a police officer, his wife is a teacher, and you look at them in the eye and say, good, it's just another one dead. They lost their son to an accidental fentanyl poisoning about 3 years ago. And I always say they're, quote, a normal family. They were engaged. They loved their boy. He was not a drug user. He had a sinus infection and he hadn't slept for days. So he was super desperate. And essentially what happened is Aaron went to his friend and his buddy said, I have a pill that's just going to help you sleep. They didn't really know what it was. They thought it was maybe a Percocet worst case scenario. He took that pill. Within minutes, he walked to his bedroom and my friend found his son dead that next morning. That's not right? We shouldn't be stigmatizing folks that are dying from substance use, and we shouldn't be stigmatizing people that use drugs. So we don't know the backstory often, right? We fail as a society and as frontline providers to simply say, what is your story? We have to do that more often. Lots of the drugs that you're going to be seeing will still be fentanyl, Demerol, torfentanyl, oxycodone, and methadone. We've all heard of Oxy before. Oxy was gigantic in the 90s into the early 2000s, roughly. It's still super popular, but you're likely not getting legitimate Oxy. They've proven through drug testing, there's a huge supply of fake Oxy and it's fentanyl. So what happens is that's a fairly low level opioid. So folks that are perhaps seeking Oxy, they'll get an Oxy pill that looks real, but it's pure fentanyl. So that's another reason why some folks are dying. They're getting a very toxic drug off of the street. When we talk about the drug itself, so fentanyl is about 100 times more poisonous than morphine. We've given fentanyl as a paramedic agency for decades, or pardon me, morphine for decades. And if you talk about your stereotypical street drugs, don't use the words powerful, potent, and strong. And I encourage you to rethink the way we're talking about these toxic substances. They're deadly, toxic, lethal, and fatal. It's not a scare tactic, but it's about changing the way we talk about street drugs that are killing people. People that are addicted or have the tendency to become hooked on a substance will look for powerful, potent, and strong. That's what they're looking for. And sometimes how that world works is if my drug supply kills half of my buddies, sometimes that means my stuff is good, and that's what people will actually seek out. So it's just about changing the way that we talk about these drugs. You can get it in a IV, obviously. A fentanyl patch was something we saw the use of, I would say probably pre-2017 or so. The fentanyl patch is literally a prescription you can get. You wear the skin patch on your hip, your shoulder, or your abdomen, and you will absorb the drug through your skin that way. We saw dealers were selling them. They were cutting them up with razor blades and selling them in little dime bags. And users were actually eating them, chewing on them, sucking on them. Some people were smoking them. That doesn't do anything. I've never seen the effect folks are looking for from smoking fentanyl patches. The most extreme case we saw in kind of rave type scenes, people were dissolving the fentanyl patches in vinegar and they were shooting them with needles. So you just have to get rid of this pop up here. Sorry, guys. So again, any way you can get this product, they will market it, they will sell it. You can put it into your body in a variety of different ways. Intranasal is obviously in your nose. Sublingual, you can get a fentanyl lozenge. You can get a prescription for a fentanyl lollipop. They're an excellent product. We've never seen the use of those, but the criminal element has stepped in. And I always say this one, to be honest, okay, so we're back on. So talking about fentanyl lozenges, again, we have the fentanyl lollipops, which you can get from a physician. A lot of cancer patients, bless their hearts, post-surgery patients can lay in bed and suck on a fentanyl lollipop. But the criminal element has stepped in. And again, I often say this one pisses me off because they found a way to cook the fentanyl and they make it look and taste like candy. That's why they call it nerds. It's just like nerds candy. They cook it, they add a can of root beer, Great Crusher, orange soda, and it flavors it, colors it, and looks just like nerds candy. You can inhale it, obviously. Most of the opioids are going to be in pill form. So the majority of opioids in Canada are coming in pill pressed, and folks will be popping pills like that. So please don't think there's a green cloud of fentanyl gas or powder looking to capture you floating around. Most of them are going to be pressed into pills already. Blotter tabs, a lot of folks don't know what these are, but we all know what acid is for some reason. These look like acid. They're kind of small square pieces of paper, and they brand them to make them marketable and cool. I've seen, sports team logos, cartoon characters, rap bands, car manufacturer brands, whatever makes their product marketable and cool. Essentially what they do is they soak or spray the sheet in liquid fentanyl. So again, they can't control where that opioid lands within that sheet. So you can get, some of these blotter tabs could have no drug on it and the next ones could be concentrated. And they take it like acid. They'll put it on their tongues and they absorb the drug through their mouth that way. We've seen some, again, in rave settings, people will actually wear these on their bodies, in their groins, their armpits, sometimes on their forehead actually. And they throw on the toque or a bandana and they go off and they party and they will absorb the drug through their skin that way. We haven't seen stickers yet that I'm aware of in Manitoba, but they've basically taken like a generic job well done sticker and they're spraying it with a liquid opioid. And it's like an activated drug sticker now. And again, folks will take that like acid, they'll put it on their tongues and will absorb the drug through their mucous membranes that way. That picture of the blotters was seized in Winnipeg. For some reason, they think Winnipeg might have been the first city in the continent to have blotter tabs. Not sure why, maybe we just like a good deal. Not sure why that was, but these were huge back in 2016 to about 19. They're still here, but not as prevalent as they were back then. Purple heroin is something that you'll hear about. I always say heroin and fentanyl aren't dangerous enough. Let's combine them together. And that's exactly what this is. They've combined heroin and fentanyl together and created what they call purple down. There's a lot of different street names for it. But the scary thing with this is you're going to hear me reference you don't know what you're getting. And this is further proof to that, is the fact of there's a cocaine supply that we've seen that's also being dyed different colors: purple, orange, yellow, black, brown, and so on. So that's the results we're getting back from the head of the Health Canada drug testing lab. They're saying we cannot look at a substance and tell you what it is. It has to be chemically tested. That's really, really scary. And at that dealer level, I'm not a law enforcement guy, I'm a paramedic, but they've shown that a lot of the people peddling these drugs on the street often don't know what they're selling. So that's really changed within the last 4 or 5 years. You often do not know what you're getting. And what's interestingly enough, I'll talk about methamphetamine later on, but a lot of people have the attitude is I would never do that dirty street drug methamphetamine because I'm a professional, but I'll happily snort my, different drugs. So cocaine, if you think I'm a professional, I'm going to snort my cocaine, they've shown it has methamphetamine in it. They found such a mixed bag of drugs. If they test a supply, it's coming back with a list of different things, which is kind of new to about the last 4 or 5 years. So xylazine is something that's quite new. I actually just added this to my slideshow yesterday. I had some warnings from BC and actually your province the other day. This is a veterinarian tranquilizer that's designed to sedate horses and cows, massive animals, and they're now finding it within the drug supply in Canada. It presents like you've overdosed or poisoned on an opioid, but it does not respond to any type of treatment. That's why this is such a scary drug. We're still learning about it. And what's interesting is in the States, I found, as you can see on the slide, that less than 0.36% of overdose deaths had xylazine in it from 2015, and that skyrocketed to 6.7%. So within a 4 or 5 year period, it's just excelled like crazy. We're still learning about it. We don't know lots about it, but we know it does not respond to the treatment in the field. So not sure the premise of why people would be searching for this or why they'd be adding it to the drug supply, other than it's super cheap. And that's likely what it will come down to. Drugs like fentanyl, carfentanil, and so on are not cheap. Xylazine can be purchased for relatively cheap. Nitazines is again something new. We've been dealing with synthetic opioids for a number of years, which means we'll be dealing with kind of drug A one day, then we're experiencing something new. This one is easier to import. They discovered this about 60 years ago, and it was designed to treat pain in human beings, but it was never approved for clinical use, which means it's bad. It was never approved. This guy is 20 times more deadly than fentanyl. In all my public health connections and all the experts that I connect with, we never thought we would see something deadlier than fentanyl. And there's lots of different synthetic opioids out there that are going to make fentanyl look like candy. The problem we're having as frontline providers is the naloxone that we use to treat fentanyl overdose poisoning is sometimes not working for this. So we're having a hard time treating these overdoses in the field, pardon me. Carfentanil, I don't focus on this one too much. This was a pretty big issue for us, again, kind of pre-2019. Carfentanil was 10,000 times more deadly than morphine. This was never designed for human beings. They discovered and created this medication back in the 70s to sedate elephants. Humans are not elephants. We can't fearmonger and say every opioid patient will die. That's not true. But I can say with confidence, if you intake carfentanil, you're likely going to die. Something that's that deadly, that respiratory drive system will be instantly shut off, and there's not much we can do for these folks. Again, we saw more of this pre-2017-18. It's still out there, just not as big. Benzos, I think this is my final kind of mixed bag of drugs we're going to talk about. So a benzo drug is a drug like Xanax. And I always like to bring this up, especially to our youth. Xanax treats social anxiety, some social phobias. It's a good medication. Don't hang your head in shame if you're on it. But it's becoming normal to just pop a Xanax, even if it's not yours, and that's scary. I've engaged kids as young as grade 4, 5, and 6 that are playing and toying and trading with Xanax. I don't know if they trade their fruit roll-up for a Xanax or what happens, but it's becoming more normal. If you experience trauma, you're not getting along with mom and dad or your teachers, you break up with a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever's happening in life, it's increasing to just say, just pop a Xanax, it makes everything better. That's super scary because if you use high amounts of Xanax, you can start to muck with your brain chemistry. And what they're finding is that results in super low lows and high highs, and you kind of seesaw up and down, not where you want to be. Again, we're going to go back to the fact that if there's a big demand for Xanax, there's a huge market for fake Xanax pills out there. And that's a picture of a Xanny bar. Essentially, they're designed to break off a small piece and you slowly dose yourself. I can tell you people aren't doing that. They're just popping the whole pill, even if it's not theirs. The problem with that is that was seized in Montreal, over 2 million fake Xanax bars, and a lot of it came back positive for fentanyl. So again, I really try not to instill fear in people. Scare tactics don't work. You educate people. That one scared me with that much fake Xanax out there. So please don't treat Xanax like it's a nothing safe drug. There's a big risk to it for sure. I'll be kind of quick through these just for time's sake, you guys, but remember opioids are a significant central nervous system depressant, right? So all of your body systems will be slowed down. The biggest of which is you'll likely stop breathing. We already talked about why that happens. You don't have to be a paramedic, a nurse, or a physician to determine what somebody has overdosed on. It doesn't mean you're diagnosing. If somebody's presenting to you like they're overdosing, or perhaps they look like they're impaired by alcohol, if you look in their eyes, if their pupils are very, very pinpoint and non-reactive to light, they've likely taken a drug like fentanyl. Most of the other drugs out there will actually blow your pupils up and make them very large. Fentanyl will not do that. So you can kind of see what's happening. Sometimes people will be very quick to diagnose with somebody, oh, they're just drunk on alcohol. Do you know that for a fact? Because if you're impaired by alcohol to start, that's sometimes how a fentanyl overdose or poisoning looks like. So please don't hesitate to call 911. Don't be quick just to say, oh, they're likely just drunk, right? We don't know that. I won't focus on this one too much, but it's just a good reminder. The reason why I had this in here is what I heard locally in Winnipeg. There's a group of folks that were making a decision to try a drug because there was a paramedic station down the street from their house. I could not believe that. I can tell you, Winnipeg paramedics, I know you're not in Winnipeg, but we're one of the busiest paramedic agencies in the continent. Please don't base your drug decisions on a paramedic station being close to your house. That irreversible cell death or brain damage starts to occur very quickly. So when we stop breathing, that process of cell death starts to happen within about 3 minutes. And I don't know of any paramedic service in the country that will be at your side within 3 minutes. So more people have to call 911. Please don't hesitate. That process of cell death happens very quickly. So the antidote for an opioid overdose or poisoning is fantastic. So naloxone competes with the opioid that is attached to that part of your brain, right? So you kind of look at your brain receptor as a golf tee, and the opioid is the golf ball that plants itself on that golf tee. This antidote enters your brain. It competes with that opioid. In theory, it should remove that opioid off that receptor site, and you should start to breathe again. The biggest thing is this is not a wonder drug. It's not going to save everybody, and it's limiting. The antidote is in your system for as little as 5 minutes and as long as about 30 minutes. An opioid can be in your system for about 180 minutes. So we've seen a lot of folks lose their lives because they think, oh, I have my own supply. I'm going to take a drug. If I become unconscious, my body's going to wake me up. Now they're out of the antidote and they're going to use more opioid because they wake up and they're looking for that effect. If you give somebody the antidote medication, they're going to lose some of their high, which they're not always happy about. So we've seen it too often where folks will wake up and the first thing they do is they take more opioid. Now they have twice as much opioid running through their system, a big reason why we're seeing folks die. Okay. These are just some of the take-home kits that you can get. I know you guys have them out in Ontario. We started to distribute take-home kits in Winnipeg as a paramedic service in November. of last year. And I think we're up to around 400 kits so far. That's a positive step. Okay. So the administration of naloxone, I won't nerd out too long and talk about data, but I found it quite interesting that we noticed actually in 2012 in Winnipeg that we were ordering a lot more of it. So we started to take interest, we started to track data, we gave it 761 times in 2015. And I developed this programming in 16 because that's what we ultimately saw. We doubled what our dosing was in our city. And that was kind of a pretty big national trend as well. And you can kind of see what's happening as we kind of make our way down the list. And I often ask people, what do you think COVID did to the use of drugs like fentanyl? Did it increase, decrease, or did it kind of stay the same? 2020, we administered naloxone almost 2,700 times. Now, I don't know if you know Winnipeg, we're a big city, but we're not that big. I think we're around 800,000, 750,000 people maybe. All the public health folks that I worked with never thought we were going to exceed 2016. They thought this has got to be it. And we're just destroying that number. Last year, this is probably the most dramatic slide I can show you, almost 3,300 doses in our city. And I know through my connections in your province, they're seeing much the same thing. So people are asking, why is that happening? There's a couple of reasons. So don't forget, the number of administrations can be multiple per patient, and that's scary because what we administered yesterday is probably not enough today. So some patients are getting multiple dosing. And this simply speaks to the lethality of what these drugs are. They're incredibly toxic. They're needing more naloxone to try to reverse that patient's overdose. And I don't want to be a pessimist, but I don't see these numbers going down. I do have the first kind of quarter of 2022, and if it keeps up, we're going to destroy what we did last year. Scary and sad. Okay. These are our opioid patients. So again, this is just Winnipeg, but we had 357 patients in 2012 and almost 1,900 last year. So these are folks that were either affected by opioids, perhaps they lost their lives, or the paramedics acknowledged this is a fentanyl patient. Again, society often thinks that the only people dealing with substance use are people that they see struggling on the street. That's what society still thinks. We need to correct that because part of that stigma reduction strategy is to destigmatize folks that are struggling. And you have to remember the people you see struggling down the street that can't hide their addiction in their $1 million house. That's what society thinks. It's only those people. And that's simply not right. We don't have 1,900 people living on the street in our core. I can map out all of our substance use incidents throughout the city with a red dot, which I've done, and they're all over the city of Winnipeg. We can't deny there's a concentration downtown. Like I think every city kind of has their core neighborhood. There's a concentration down there, but it's not everybody. And what's interesting is sometimes when we will respond to our core neighborhood for a substance use call, the ambulance bill is being sent to the peripheries of Winnipeg where people think it never happens. People that are struggling with addiction or trauma and they live in those typical white picket fence neighborhoods, they will hide their addiction. They won't struggle down the street with a needle sticking out of their arm. They're going to hide their addiction. So again, you find out what somebody's story is, and I'm going to remind you again, whatever capacity you operate in, we're not taking the time to sit down with these human beings, put your hand on their shoulder and say, what's your story? Find out what their story is. You'll be instantly humbled. I always talk about a man that we worked with for a number of years in Winnipeg, and he did not have a home. He lived on the street for years and years, and none of us, paramedicine, law enforcement, the healthcare system, nobody asked him what his background was, what his story was. And I always say he was the dirtiest, smelliest, most unkept human being I've ever seen. And people kind of say, that's kind of mean to say. What do you think society did to him? Because he was homeless, he smelt, and he was dirty. They threw him out like a bag of garbage because he didn't fit that mold. And I remember treating this man one day, and out from his pocket fell his World War II vet card. He was one of the Indigenous fighters that fought in World War II for the country that we all are benefiting from and what we enjoy today. And nobody asked what his story was. And I used to say to the groups that I talked to, are you aware what happened to the returning Indigenous fighters from the World Wars? And don't answer that question. I just want you to quietly ask yourself that. Do you know what that history is? If you don't, I used to say shame on you, and that's not fair. Shame on this system for not educating us. My son's 14 years old. He makes being a parent incredibly easy. He's an amazing human being. He's been raised to be inclusive and compassionate, and he appreciates what that history is. If you return from the world wars and you looked like me, you were the stereotypical white male, you were treated like a hero. You were given pension, benefits, and housing, and welcomed with a red carpet. The Indigenous fighters that fought for your country were not allowed to vote. They returned and they were told to piss off and go away. They did not receive pension, benefits, or housing. So you start to appreciate some of that generational trauma, and you start to appreciate what was robbed from these folks. So again, you sit down and say, what is your story? There's no way on earth that man should have died on the streets of Winnipeg. Not a chance, but none of us asked him what his story is. Some people will say, like, what's the point? Why would I care? Why would I ask somebody what their story is if I'm only with them for 20, 30 minutes? The point is you're showing a level of compassion that they perhaps never had before. You might be the only person in their lives that have said, what's your story? Listen, I'm with you for half an hour. I'm going to find out what your story is and tell me what your story is. These people want to tell you what their story is. They simply want somebody to care. Okay. All right. We're going to switch. We're going to talk about methamphetamine. I usually take a little break here, but we're not going to do that because we're being taped on this one. Some of the things that you're going to hear me talk about again is don't use drugs alone. This is something kind of new that I've thrown into my slide bank. I think we're naive to think that people are still not going to use substances. Of course they are, right? Sitting through a presentation about substance use and addiction and trauma, it's not going to change your mind. It might. If you still use drugs, never use drugs alone. Get your drugs tested, and don't forget about the Good Samaritan Drug Law Act. If you don't know what that is, please spread the word. It was a law that the federal government enacted. I think it was the end of 2016, maybe the beginning of 2017. And essentially what this does is it protects you from criminal charges if you call 911 to save a life. Because what was happening was people were bailing on their buddies to die. They didn't want to get in trouble. They didn't want to be arrested. They didn't want their parents or their teachers to find out. So they left people to die. That makes my skin crawl. So if you think somebody's affected by any substance, don't hesitate to call 911. It's not a trap. You're not going to be criminally charged if you have drugs on you. Okay, spread that word. They did not promote that law enough. In 4 years in Canada, we've lost about almost 17,000 people, specific due to drugs like fentanyl. I'm heading back to Vancouver in a couple of weeks. At their peak, they were losing 150 people a month in that city. That's incredible. And again, we just can't speak to the tainted market out there. I do have some federal testing results. I said it before, but it blows my mind when they're testing one pill, one liquid, one blotter tab, whatever, and it's coming back for a menu of different drugs. It's incredible. Okay. Never mind the questions for right now. We're going to skip to the next one. We'll talk about methamphetamine. This one's not nearly as long as the first component. So methamphetamine, I can tell you, is a huge issue for us here in Winnipeg. And of course, every province has it, but it's a big issue here. Opioids are pretty expensive to purchase and to manufacture and to traffic. Meth is super, super cheap. It's easy to make. It's extremely cheap to buy. It's easy to traffic. And it sustains and maintains a high for a long time. It's the polar opposite to drugs like fentanyl. It's the most potent stimulant on our planet today. And just to back up a little bit, fentanyl typically for a point of opioids is about 30 or 40 bucks. There could be lots of variables there. The point of methamphetamine is about $5 or $10 a point. So it's substantially cheaper and you can maintain a high for a long time. Meth is interesting. They discovered it around 1893. They think it was a Japanese chemist that was kind of playing in his lab and poof, he created amphetamines. We don't talk about this enough, but it was widely used in World War II. I wish we talked about this more because what damage did we do? War is disgusting. I think we all know that, especially now, with what's happening in Europe. War is appalling, actually, but in a time of war, it kind of made sense. Soldiers were given these tin capsules and they were said, just keep on popping these pills, march forward and kill. And that's exactly what they did. If you're methamphetamine your soldiers, they're becoming aggressive, and they often don't have to eat, sleep, or rest. That's what methamphetamine does to you. So it made more production, and they just did exactly what they were told to do, really without having the need to rest. Pretty sad. There's a new version of methamphetamine out there. If you hear about, I usually say amphetamine versus methamphetamine, don't worry about the difference. They're almost exactly the same drug, but it's all methamphetamine because meth permeates the blood-brain barrier easier than amphetamine. So when you watch like kind of US-based shows, when you hear them saying amphetamine, it's not super accurate. What's happening now is there's a new version of methamphetamine called P2P meth. And this is a version of methamphetamine that's pretty scary. The likelihood of a meth-induced psychosis is much higher. The hallucinations and the paranoia that folks are experiencing on this new version of meth is really, really scary. And essentially they're finding this is more solvent-based. So, you know, pseudoephedrine, as you probably know, is a very powerful stimulant, which is what they typically used for the old version of this drug. You now replace that with lots of different solvents. So acetone, cyanide, mercury, racing fuels, are different acids, battery acids. Still has the same effect times about 50,000. Okay. So P2P concerns, what are they? Increased likelihood of a meth-induced psychosis. And I already talked about this, the hallucinations and the delusions is far higher. And the toxicity of this version of meth is dramatically worse than the previous version of methamphetamine. So as a frontline provider, we're pretty concerned that the likelihood of violence is going to likely increase. Again, we can't stigmatize people and say every methamphetamine patient is violent. That's not true. Actually, a low percentage of folks that use methamphetamine will become violent, but when it happens, it's really, really scary. So we'll switch to this picture, and I always say, I wish I was with you guys, but when I ask the groups I present to, it's kind of a smart ass question: who thinks men and women are equal? And it's funny because when I ask that question, people are like, he actually went there, and people in the room are kind of doing this, I think so. And my smart ass reply is, we're not equal. There's a ton of work that still needs to be done. And I mean that. Of course we're equal, but we're not. A lot of work still needs to be done. But thank God we're not 1940s, 1950s, 60s. This is a real advertisement from a New York newspaper where they typically picked on women because especially back then, they were typically stay-at-home moms and wives. That's just what happened back then. And they targeted that. They said, if you want to be a better mom, a better wife, have more energy, be slim, be fit, take amphetamine. That's disgusting. It was not a controlled drug until about the 1970s. So I say with humor, you can go buy your large pizza with a side of methamphetamine. It's ridiculous that it was not a controlled drug until the 70s. This again was from New York. I think this was from the 60s. And this basically says, if you eat too much or you feel depressed, take methadone. Are you kidding me? Thankfully, we've evolved and we don't do that anymore. But the damage we did was likely nasty. Okay. All right. Anybody like what they see? I like putting this picture up. Again, I can't see you. I can't see the room, but I guaranteed you did what most people do. When I'm sitting in a room with 1,000 people at a big conference and I'd put this picture up, it always resulted in the same thing. People would whisper and giggle and kind of shift their shoulders and smile. And the reason being is if you like what you see, you activate the reward system of your brain. So I could live inside of that chocolate cake, right? I like what I see. When you think of something that rewards you or a moment of pleasure, just by thinking about it, you release a little bit of dopamine, which is your happy chemical. It's a neurotransmitter that makes you happy. That's what we release when you feel positive things. That's what methamphetamine targets. Yes, meth is not chocolate cake, I get it, but it targets the same part of your brain. So it releases inhuman amounts of serotonin and dopamine, which are, people call them your happy chemicals. So you have to remember that the overwhelming majority of folks that use drugs are treating trauma. You have to be sensitive to that fact. There's very, very few people that we engage that just made a stupid decision in life. It happens, but it's super rare. You can almost always trace that substance use disorder back to that aha moment. And it could be anything from physical abuse, sexual abuse, bullying, mental health issues, generational trauma. Lots of trauma causes people to go down that drug and alcohol road. And methamphetamine does a good job. Clearly, it's not a treatment, but this suppresses your reality. Almost every methamphetamine patient that I've encountered, I've been into the treatment centers, I've been into the jails to engage lots of these folks, and it's from trauma. We don't talk about that enough. I co-presented with an adolescent psychologist a number of years ago, and his national research was showing up to 96% of adolescent addiction is from trauma. So again, what business do we have looking down on somebody and saying, what a piece of crap because they use drugs? Really? Ask them what their story is. Find out what their trauma is. It's likely triggered by something pretty terrible, okay? We can't tell people, like we used to say, you try meth once and you're done for life. That's what they used to tell me. You try meth and you're done for life, and shame on that message. That's not true. If you say that, you're removing any hope to recover from that drug, and we can't do that. Now, meth is horribly difficult to recover from. It's not like alcohol or some other drugs where you can fly off to the mountains for a month and perhaps do well. The scary thing with meth is your brain will stop producing dopamine because it requires and it needs the methamphetamine to do that for you. If I'm addicted to methamphetamine, I stop today. They've shown worst case scenario, it could take my brain 2 years to reset, to start producing normal amounts of dopamine again. That's really scary. Life does not exist without dopamine. What do we do with these folks for 2 years? That's why treatment is extremely difficult. There's no magic answer for this one, okay? Okay, I think this is really cool. We're gonna kind of compare the release of dopamine. So we know when we eat, that's why we enjoy food. You celebrate events, we surround ourselves with food. You go home today after a long day, maybe you have a bag of chips and you're like, I know it's not good for me, I'm only gonna have a handful. Yeah, right. Before you know it, the bag is gone. Sometimes we eat when we're not hungry because you're actually enjoying a little bit of a dopamine high from eating, about 150% increase. So it's like, I'm eating, I'm not hungry, but I feel crappy. This feels good because you're riding a little bit of a dopamine high, okay? Social media and video games. I usually talk about this for a long time. Again, I'm going to date myself here. I was not raised on this device. They started to implement computers, I think, when I was maybe in grade 9 or 10, I think. And the research of this is really concerning because the addiction to these devices, especially to our youth, our kids, before your brain is fully developed around 25 years old, you're releasing about 175% increase of dopamine from requiring this device and constantly accessing it. The problem with that is our youth, our kids, are expecting and demanding their dopamine to constantly be spiking because of these devices. That's not normal, that's not human to expect constant dopamine spikes. And that's what's happening. So clearly, there is a place for these. I'm not saying, we need to chuck them all over the garbage, but monitor what your use of these devices are, especially if you're under 25 years old, especially with our young kids. I'm not saying if a 10-year-old loses their iPad that they're going to go shoot methamphetamine. I'm not saying that, but how do we deal with that void when life happens? When they face some trauma, how do they deal with that void when they're saying, well, I'm confused because my whole life I've been constantly spiking dopamine by these devices? Okay. Food for thought. So how about sex? A healthy sex life? About 200%. When I talk to my son about sex, he's 14, and I usually say, buddy, when you're 40 years old, when you're 40 years old, you can maybe have sex, and you can only have it once or twice because that's why people have kids, and then we have a little chuckle. And this is the only one you don't get a picture for. But I usually talk about this one a little bit. About 5 years ago now, my phone rang. And I answered my phone and it was a lady and she said, hey, Cory, my name is so-and-so. We've heard about your programming and your approach and your attitude. And we're wondering if you would consider coming and working with our girls. And I thought, yeah, what's this all about? And I've been super privileged and very humbled for the past 5 years to be working with the trafficked girls in our city. That I was blown away. It was a really hard step for me to take as a male wearing a uniform, walking into a room with trafficked girls. And I would suggest women that are being trafficked are the most traumatized humans on our planet. I always have a really tough time getting through this component. I've given this presentation a gajillion times and it just breaks my heart. I clearly can't include some of the slides when I work with that group, but I always say I've learned more from them than they've learned from me. And it's a huge victory when I can break down some of those barriers and gain more trust of what this uniform stands for. Ambulances, even police cars, hospitals, drop-in centers, universities, those should be safe places. They should be safe places. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But it's not always who you think it is. And what disgusts me is in Manitoba, they sometimes have to run 120 girls a year through these programs. That's disgusting. That means there's a huge demand for it. And society, the justice system should not be going after these women. They should be going after the males, those mutts that are demanding that service. That's who we need to be going after. We need to embrace and support, educate, and build up all of these women that are being trafficked. That's what we really need to be doing. And I always say it's not always who you think it is. I'd be lying if I said society didn't think it happened to one demographic. It's just those girls. That's not the case. We worked with a young girl that was from a community in Winnipeg called Charleswood. And Charleswood is a very upper middle class neighborhood where the naive society thinks nothing ever happens, which is so wrong. This is a very typical scenario. She met a guy when she was 13 years old. She came from a very, quote, normal home. Both mom and dad loved her. They were engaged. They were part of her life. She's 13. That frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. And she meets a guy that is a master of his craft. He's an older guy that can give her money and support. He bought her nice things, made her feel validated and important and attractive, and very quickly got her hooked on drugs. And cocaine is often what they choose. Not really sure why that is, other than they have lots of it. So starts giving her large amounts of drugs and says, I'm never going to charge you. I love you. I'm a great guy. Don't worry. You never have to pay for this. Starts giving her large amounts of coke, and one day presents her with a big brick of cocaine. And he said, again, I love you. Not going to charge you. I'm going to let you use half of this, but you have to sell the other half for me. He does that maybe over a 5 or 6 month period. And no, she's never going to pay that debt. She's 13 years old. She doesn't have the money. He does that for a while and approaches her and he says, you owe me $60,000. Sorry, guys, I have a terrible time with this. I don't have 60 grand, and a little 13-year-old angel is not going to have 60 grand. She says, I don't have 60 grand. He says, yeah, I know. He says, you have 3 choices. Your first option is you pay your debt and I'll leave you alone. I'm going to go away. Second option is I'm going to kill your baby sister. Or your third option, you can go to this address. It gives her a business card. Says you can show up and you can start paying off your debt. And before you know it, this little 13-year-old angel is embedded in that trafficking world, and she's being trafficked like crazy to pay that debt off. There's tons and tons of stories like that. Youth that age out of the system. When you're 18 years old, you age out of the system and they're done with you. I'm sure I'm going to take some heat at some point. I frankly don't care. When the system is done with you when you're 18 years old, they're done. You're thrown out and you're typically on your own. That world of trafficking is waiting for those girls to age out. A lot of them are being captured as soon as they turn 18 years old and they have nobody. So again, it's about finding out what your story is. Treat them with dignity, with respect. You need to embrace them and support them. It's not always who you think it is. And we know most of the trafficking in our 2022 world is virtually. Most of it's done through the internet. They're not standing on street corners like they used to. Okay, cocaine gives you about a 450% increase. So you can kind of see what starts to happen. And I've said it before, a lot of professionals will use cocaine. I'm not naive, I'm well aware of that. They'll say, I never do methamphetamine, that's a dirty street drug. Well, if you're snorting cocaine, you're intaking methamphetamine. The federal testing results have shown that. Okay. Methamphetamine, what do you get from meth? I usually ask the group. I usually hear 600%, 800%, 900%. It's actually about 1,300%. That's what happens with methamphetamine. So I usually tell people, oh, Cory's addicted to meth, that's the problem. Actually, I'm addicted to that dopamine high. I require that methamphetamine to produce dopamine. That's what we're really dealing with. So again, I face a bunch of trauma in life. Methamphetamine comes along, I can suppress what that trauma is. It's a very slippery slope. Most folks using meth are injecting with needles. We know that, but you can't snort it, swallow it, smoke it, or you can inject it with needles. The vast majority of methamphetamine patients that we encounter are shooting with needles. They sometimes start with smoking, but they will describe nothing beats the needle, and that's what they turn to quickly. I clearly can't show these pictures to the women that I work with. That's a big trigger point. But most of the meth we encounter looks like the middle picture, kind of like dirty broken glass. And at the end of the day, meth is meth is meth. There's still some people that say, if my methamphetamine looks healthier, it must be better for me. Meth is meth is meth. The end product does not matter. It's still the same list of chemicals. Some of the psychological impacts or the effects that folks are getting. Again, euphoria, dysphoria, alertness, self-confidence, social ability. What are you doing? You're suppressing what you can't do. You're suppressing what your reality is, and you're able to function to a point, right? The opioids can get you very quickly. Methamphetamine will get you. It just takes a little bit longer. These are some of the effects of long-term use. We'll speed up a little bit. You can kind of skim through them, but I mean, you imagine you finish your day at home and you have a nice big glass of battery acid. We don't do that. When you're putting those chemicals in your body will start to dissolve from the inside out, literally. Okay. So methamphetamine is pretty interesting. The rush you get, so you inject, smoke, or swallow, that flood of serotonin and dopamine is only about 30 minutes long. There's a lot of variables there. It's actually quite quick, and they start coming down fairly quickly, but you can still be high for hours or days. That's true, but you're never high enough. So after a few times of using the drug, they start to binge very, very quickly because they're trying to get to that point when they first use that drug. And what's interesting about meth is you can't obtain that level of high ever again. So the first couple of times you use the drug, you'll get that massive spike and you'll never get that high again. So they start to take large amounts of that methamphetamine, saying, why can't I get to that point? And you physically can't, okay? You don't have to focus on the crash. It's really much like any other substance. So a lot of the care that we're providing as paramedics is really symptom-based. It's not quite as sexy as fentanyl. There's not much we can do for these patients. There's an antipsychotic medication that we've been administering for about 2 years. They have to be willing to take it, and we often don't see the benefit of it very quickly. It takes a long time for it to work, but the biggest hope is folks that are wanting help will stay in hospital. A lot of our substance use patients will leave. We'll triage them to the hospital and they're gone. Because if they're told to wait in the waiting room for 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 hours, they're not going to be sticking around. So hopefully with the antipsychotic drug, it will calm them down to the point where they'll be perhaps less violent and they'll be able to stay for care. Chemical sedation is something that we do. The advanced care paramedics can concoct 2 very strong drugs, and we will inject you and we will chemically sedate you. There's not much else we can do for these patients. Okay. The antidotes, as some people say, there is no antidote for methamphetamine. There's no replacement therapy for methamphetamine. Okay. I'll probably get rid of this slide. It's pretty common sense stuff, but what I can say is we can now predict the likelihood of what their outcomes will be. They may be violent, they may not be violent. The biggest thing we see are repeat clients or repeat patients, and that's heartbreaking. You'll never hear me publicly say, poor me, we're busy, we're working overtime because of these issues. That's a slap in the face to people that are dealing with this. It is heartbreaking when we see the same patient over and over again. And there's a plethora of people that we see that are begging for help, but the system says there's no room at the end. Come back in 3 months, come back in 6 months, or do you have $100 grand to fly off to the mountains? Most of us don't. The system needs to be robust enough that if you're ready to access help, we can get you that help immediately. If we keep telling people to come back in 3 months, we're likely not going to see them again. Okay, so yes, we need to increase care for sure. Almost done here, guys, but these are some of the numbers that we're looking at. I know a lot of it's Winnipeg based, but we typically do between 7,000 and 10,000 calls a year for different things. It could be alcohol, it could be drugs, whatever, about 10,000 calls a year. And I will digress and say the biggest offender for substance is still alcohol. I think we all know that, right? That's the most toxic substance on our planet, but it's socially acceptable. Like we have sports teams that will use it for marketing, to advertise, for sponsorship deals, but it's super, super toxic. Socially acceptable. In my programming, I have to pick and choose what I deal with because of time. Alcohol is not one that I typically focus on, but it's still a big issue for sure. Winnipeg in 2013, we had about 15 methamphetamine patients a month. We now see over 250 a month. If I included all of the rural communities outside of Winnipeg, those numbers would be absolutely staggering. The Indigenous communities that are not only Manitoba, but all provinces are being steamrolled by this drug. They need help. Okay, all right. So there's some national testing results for you guys just to kind of chew on a little bit. It's interesting, most of the samples coming back are containing fentanyl. Even if somebody's looking for a stimulant drug, be it cocaine or methamphetamine, a lot of it's coming back positive for drugs like fentanyl. Kind of confusing because it does not make sense. Fentanyl is expensive, meth is cheap, but the cross-contamination that they'll worry about is likely what that's from. So dealers will use one scale, one room, one table. They're not super clean, nor do they care. So they're perhaps getting drugs that are kind of mixing on their tables or their scales. I always end with another really quick story. I always talk about my professional humbling moment. It happened to me when I was still on the street as a paramedic, and it was a guy that we dealt with for a number of years. And his story was pretty interesting. He lived on the strip, which is right behind my office. That's kind of our downtown core area. He lived on the street and he didn't fit that mold though. Like there was something off with him. As a frontline provider, you kind of get a good sense of where people are from, or kind of they're not fitting that mold. And he didn't fit that mold. Like something was off with him. We would take him to the hospital. He would put his mouth beneath like the hand sanitizer station and fill his mouth full. Anything he could put into his body, he would do that. And none of us, nobody in his journey ever asked him, what's your story? Where are you from? And I remember this guy looking at me one day and he said, you know what? I'm reminded every day I'm a worthless human being. I don't need that anymore. I'm well aware of that. And he would stand on a street corner with a sign, right? People would chuck pennies in his face. They would chuck garbage in his face. Get a job, you bum, you piece of trash. They would just demean him. We ended up putting this guy's story together. His story was, he was a very successful businessman from another large city in Canada that went off to work one day and got a phone call that his 2 kids and wife were killed in a devastating car accident. And for him to treat that trauma, he started drinking to suppress that loss. The alcohol wouldn't cut it, so he turned to anything he could input into his body just to suppress that trauma. And not one person in his journey asked what your story is. Imagine what could have happened if our first interaction with him, somebody sat down, put their arm around him and said, you know what, dude, I'm here for you. Where are you from? What's your story? That man should not have experienced that much trauma, that much repeated trauma while being reminded you're a worthless human being. Find out what somebody's story is, you guys. If somebody's struggling, don't push them off into a corner. Support them, right? If I get diagnosed with cancer, touch wood, God forbid, you're likely going to support me. You're going to cry with me, send me terrible casseroles. You'll send me cards and flowers and phone me and text me. If you find out I'm addicted or I'm dealing with drugs, you'll push me off into a corner. And that's what society is still doing today, for the most part. We need to support these folks, embrace them, and just simply be there for them. You're not going to be able to fix all of their problems, but be there for them to support them. say, look, I don't agree with what you're doing. I'm still your friend. I'm still here for you. We need to stop isolating folks. What's interestingly enough, just before I end, is the naloxone distribution program that I developed in Winnipeg for paramedics to hand out. I'm incredibly humbled with the amount of ranking city staff, law enforcement, fire, paramedicine, middle, high-ranking city staff that approach me in confidence to say, you know what, can I have one of those kits? I'm dealing with this at home with my kids, maybe with my spouse. Really, really humbled me. So you don't know what somebody next to you is necessarily dealing with. I hope you learned something. I'm going to end the formal talk right now. I went a few minutes past. Thank you very much for having me. And I think Marley has maybe a few questions for me. And just before you chime on, if anybody wants to connect with me afterwards, Marley, you can provide my cell phone number, my email. If you guys want to email me, text me, or call me, go for it. Sometimes people don't want to ask questions in public, so feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was such an amazing presentation. And I want to say thank you for a couple of things. Thank you, first of all, for, quote unquote, going there and pointing out the inequities that exist. People like to say that, genders are equal or, but that exists. And I think that is prevalent when we talk about these topics. And I also wanted to say thank you. I know it's like really hard topic to bring up, but thank you for mentioning and bringing up like sex trafficking. And like there's a person in my life who, has that similar story that you described. So it is happening. It happens in Canada. It's not, something that's you just hear about infrequently. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And also thank you for the level of compassion that you bring in your speaking. And it's just, you connect really well with your audience, and, you just bring this level of empathy and compassion that it's really valuable. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
So I do have some questions. I'll ask, Brittany or Rose, you're here right now. Do you guys have any questions that came up during the presentation?
I just have, I'll just say a quick thank you for I think I've said this as speakers across the board have done a great job of bringing up personal accounts and stories and whatnot, but I feel like I've said this in a lot of ways about the story you first told, your first account of the first encounter you had with that gentleman, the veteran story and whatnot. And we just had here the first Veterans Indigenous Day here in Canada that is now officially hopefully going to continue to be a thing that we have every year here in Canada. And I think it's important. I'm a military child. I grew up in the Canadian Armed Forces. My father is still an active serving veteran and whatnot, of Afghanistan and all that. So like, thank you for bringing that up. And, I think that's very important that you mentioned that you don't know who you're talking to. And my father always emphasized that and show compassion towards everybody. So thank you for bringing in that piece. I think that's always very important. And I just had a question about this last slide here. Do you think maybe that they're mixing fentanyl and methamphetamine almost as a way to, in either order, to dilute one of the substances with the other to almost make the user come back for more of one of the substances? Like it could be in either order, to come back to get more methamphetamine or to get more fentanyl, like either or, because they have completely different pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. That was my thought, like in terms of that reaction, because they make no sense, like you said, like in terms of how they react in the body.
Yeah, very good question. That's something that I get asked often. So, financially, from a drug dealing perspective, it does not make sense. They're taking a very expensive product, being the opioids, and cross-contaminating or adding it to a cheap drug like methamphetamine. It financially does not make sense. And that drug dealing world is strictly financially geared, right? It's strictly money driven. So it doesn't make sense. They're a little bit confused by that one. Very good point. And what they're thinking is it's likely being cross-contaminated more than purposely laced. There is a component of people on that same thought that will sell or advertise their methamphetamine with more of a depressant drug with the theory of you won't experience a meth-induced psychosis. They're actually selling that concept to them. Gabapentin was actually something that they were selling with methamphetamine here, because like, let's face it, no matter what drug you use, people don't want to put a danger to themselves nor others. So they're saying, hey, you won't become hyper paranoid with my methamphetamine because I'm going to sell gabapentin with it. They were actually like making that little deal with them. So I don't have a super clear answer. There is some thought, and you're right about if you're a person that's seeking opioids for that downer type of a effect, and you're getting a stimulant, you're right. They're probably going to come back to you to buy more of that product. So that would likely make sense. But the information I'm getting back from Health Canada and law enforcement is they're accidentally cross-contaminating different things, right? It's coming from the same source, the same scale, that same table, and they just don't care. Yeah, not a super clear answer because we don't know all those answers. And it's confusing again because it's money driven. It does not make sense to add an expensive product to a batch of, cheap methamphetamine.
Yeah, because I know you can take some like benzodiazepines, I know will counteract some of the effects of opioids, like some of the nausea and stuff like that too. Like that, I don't have to tell you that.
Yeah.
But like I know that, like, yeah. So like I'm just like, yeah, I'm like, that's so puzzling to me. I don't know why that would happen. Like,
no, and
like why they'd be doing that. They do the two opposite things. It's like kind of like, yeah.
Yeah. So again, like from a financial perspective, it makes a little bit of sense because that customer will likely come back to you quicker.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. And it's tricky because the different analogs that we're seeing of opioids, like sort of fake fentanyl, the analogs that we're seeing are going to make fentanyl look like candy, but that's because the tolerance that you build up very quickly to opioids means you need a lot more of that drug tomorrow than you need it today. So these analogs that are coming along that are brutally deadly, I can say to you guys, are just that strong. So it's filling some of that void, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation. It was really an incredible presentation. I think you brought such like a real and like raw perspective to like how this is actually affecting people, which I think is so important because like you said, like people are so quick to judge like people's coping strategies or things like this, but they don't, think about like why they're doing this. I think like we live in a society nowadays where people like don't think they owe other people anything, but like you do owe people like the basic kindness and like compassion and respect. And like cases like this, like just like sitting down and like asking someone or like giving them that kindness and compassion could really like actually like change their life or like turn it around for the better. So I think it's really important to like hear these stories, although they're hard to talk about, because it really does put it into perspective of like why this happens, like a substance use disorder isn't like a thing that like people just choose to do. Like it's a product of something, like usually trauma. So hearing these stories is like really important, I think, for people to really understand that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Brittany.
So one of the questions that I have is, from a policy perspective or, change, kind of looking at the way the system is set up right now. When you talked about there's often like repeated patients, what else other than asking their stories could be implemented to help people who keep coming in the system? Or I've heard stories from paramedics who they see the same patient, they're like, oh, we're seeing this guy again or this woman again, like they go to the hospital and then they go right back to where they were before. What do you think could be changed, or what should we work on as a society?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the biggest thing first and foremost is we and I said it before, we have to have access to instant care. There's a huge gap that's missing there, and it doesn't matter where you live; it happens everywhere. The system needs to be more robust, and it needs to support people right now. You need to meet people where they're at, right? If somebody comes to you and they are using a substance or using a drug, who cares? Don't make your facility that you have to be quote unquote clean to access help. right? If somebody wants help, give them the help. Don't tell them to come back in 3 weeks.
Right.
And for sure, I mean, any frontline provider, I always say, be it again, law enforcement, police, fire, nursing, whatever, that first point of contact is what often starts that incident off. And if that incident starts off with ugly, gross stigma and bias and sometimes racism and judgment and hate, that incident's going to spiral out of control. You're the first person that's going to start what that flavor is, right? So we have to support these people with compassion. And as providers, if your compassion tank is emptying, which does happen, I've been there, done that. How do we refill that tank again? I don't have that magic answer, but we have to look at the system of burnout and say, look, yes, paramedics, law enforcement, police, healthcare providers, psychologists, teachers, whatever, that compassion tank will start to empty. What do we do about that? We have to look at ways to increase that I care factor, right? I was going to say something else, but I just caught myself. Yeah, so I mean, quick care, supervised consumption sites. I get asked about that all of the time. And I'm going to be very transparent. I have to walk a fine line with that because there's other decision makers that are much higher than I am that are dealing with that. It's a very political issue. It's actually one of the most politically heated issues right now. But that's a system that does save lives, and it does provide a level of care, but you have to have that care system in place first, right? So I've said publicly, I support them 100% in a supporting role, but if we can't offer that door down the hall for instant, compassionate, appropriate, culturally sensitive care, should we be inventing that supervised consumption site first before we have that piece? And that's what I struggle with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's really interesting. I think that was mostly, you covered most of our questions. I'm just looking them over. I think I wrote down another.
I do have a question that would kind of go off of that one. It's kind of very similar, but I think like a lot of the time, like the mental health system that we have kind of like sets people up for failure, right? Like say you go into the hospital with like a mental health concern, or like, even if it's things like, oh, like you're like thinking of suicide, like they just like put you in a room until you're safe and then they send you back home. And I think it's very similar with like substance use disorders, right? Like you go in, they make sure like until you like come down from your high and they send you back out onto the street, which like obviously doesn't work and it isn't very helpful. So like, how do you think in like hospitals, let's say, we can like adjust that? Like what needs to be in place in hospitals? Like, is it social workers? Is it like specific nurses trained in like mental health? Like, you know what I mean? Like there needs to be something in there that they like get a little bit better, or they know what sports are available to them before we just like send people back home.
Very good question. And I'm gonna start by saying, and I mean this, if all too often, right, young adults your age get flack. And I'm going to say it again, if you guys are the future of what our world is, we're in good hands. And I mean that. You guys have ideas and compassion that my generation does not have. We were not raised to be inclusive and full of care and compassion. So keep your heads up. That is awesome. Yes, there's a huge amount of stigma that's around mental health orders, substance use, homelessness, poverty, trauma. Absolutely, they all fall into that same lump. And I often say something that some people don't appreciate, but why are we taking people struggling with addiction and substance use or mental health, homelessness, poverty, etc., to a hospital? Why are we doing that? Why are we not taking them to a specialized facility where they're specializing in those issues? They actually give a crap. They're experts in those issues. We take you to that facility because if you have an issue, that's going to sound silly. If you have an issue with your plumbing, you're not going to call like the electrician, the roofer, the framer to figure it out. You want an expert that can deal with your plumbing issue. So the system, this is a pipe dream of mine. The system is in place where you take somebody to a specific agency or facility that deals with that specialized issue. That's what we really need to do, because you're right. All of those things are ultimately tied together. And if all of them have stigma and bias and judgment, the system's broken. The system's been broken for decades. So yes, that's what we absolutely need to do. Take people to the right facility, right? Like in pre-hospital medicine, pre-hospital care, If you have a vascular issue, a heart attack, a stroke, or a bleed, we'll take you to a particular vascular center within the city of Winnipeg. If you have a traumatic injury, we take you to the trauma center, and so on and so on and so on. If you're dealing with addiction, homelessness, mental health, we'll just take you anywhere. So yeah, that one gets me boiling for sure. Very good question.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good response. There's definitely a lot that needs to be improved on in the future. So hopefully we start working towards that.
Yeah. And I mean, at some point you guys just have to cut me off because Marley, I will talk for days, but we very quick point. I always say, yes, we have to treat the addiction, the substance use, the trauma, but at what point do we say, how do we treat trauma before it happens? Like we have to go before that happens, because we're going to be spinning our wheels for generations. What is it that causes folks to go down that road, right? Start treating that, throw your money, your attention into that, still have the treatment, but let's stop the need for all of this, right? Point 3.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. That was an amazing presentation. I'm like, I need to like step away and just process everything because that was so great. So thank you on behalf of our team and on behalf of all of our viewers. Hopefully you get a lot of people watching this presentation. So with that, if we have any last comments, I will stop the recording. Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.